When my daughter-in-law locked me in my own basement and took my house keys, I thought my life was over. I was 73 years old, crawling on a concrete floor with arthritis screaming through my joints, begging her to let me out. But what she didn't know was that crawling taught me something about survival, and when I finally made it out of that basement, I didn't crawl to the police. I didn't crawl to my neighbors. I crawled straight to my bank, and what I did there changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, I was doing what I'd done every Tuesday for the past 15 years since Harold passed. I was in my garden behind our little blue house on Maple Street in Riverside, tending to the tomatoes that Harold had planted in his final spring. The October air was crisp, and my hands were dirty with good soil when I heard the car doors slam in my driveway. My name is Ursula Martinez, but everyone calls me Urs. I've lived in this house for 42 years, raised 3 children here, buried my husband from the front parlor, and never once imagined I'd be afraid in my own home. I was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall even in my good shoes. With silver hair I kept in a neat bun and hands that showed every year of hard work. My late husband Harold used to say I was built like a sparrow but had the heart of a hawk. I never knew how true those words would become. The voices coming from my front yard weren't familiar, friendly tones. They were sharp, businesslike, and far too early for social calls. I wiped my hands on my gardening apron and walked around the side of the house, my arthritic knees protesting with each step on the uneven brick pathway Harold had laid when we were young and thought we'd live forever. Standing on my front porch was my daughter-in-law Carmen, but she looked different than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the sweet smile she usually wore during our monthly family dinners. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a black business suit that made her look like she was attending a funeral. Behind her stood 2 men in similar dark clothing, both carrying clipboards and briefcases. Carmen had married my youngest son, Raphael, 3 years ago in a beautiful ceremony at St. Augustine's Cathedral. She was 28 to his 35, with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. Raphael had been so happy when he brought her home to meet me, practically glowing with love. She'd called me Mama Urs from the very first dinner, helped me clear dishes, and asked for my recipe for Harold's favorite trelicious cake. I thought I'd gained a daughter, not lost a son. But standing there that Tuesday morning, watching her check items off a list while those men photographed my front door and windows, I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "Carmen?" I called out, my voice smaller than I intended. "Mija, what's happening here?" She turned, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But it passed so quickly I might have imagined it. "Oh, Urs," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Perfect timing. We need to talk." The way she said "we" made me glance at the 2 men, who had stopped their note-taking to watch our exchange with professional interest. One was tall and pale with wire-rimmed glasses, the other shorter and stockier with a thick mustache. Neither of them smiled when I nodded politely in their direction. "These gentlemen are from Riverside County Adult Protective Services," Carmen continued, her words crisp and rehearsed. "I called them because I've been worried about you living alone in this big house. You're not getting any younger, and after what happened last week..." My mind raced, trying to understand what she meant. Last week? The only thing that had happened was Raphael canceling our Sunday dinner because Carmen said she had a migraine. I'd been disappointed, but certainly not concerned about my ability to live independently. "I don't understand," I said, my hands unconsciously smoothing down my apron. "Carmen? What did you tell them?" The taller man with glasses stepped forward, consulting his clipboard. "Mrs. Martinez, we've received reports of concerning incidents. Leaving the stove on overnight, confusion about medications, difficulty maintaining the property." His voice was kind but firm, the tone people used when they thought you couldn't understand complex situations. "That's not true," I said immediately, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "I've never left the stove on. I don't take any medications except vitamins, and my house is perfectly maintained." Carmen moved closer, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume, something French and floral that I'd never noticed her wearing before. Honey, I know this is hard to accept, but last Sunday when Raphael and I came by, you answered the door in your nightgown at 3 in the afternoon. You said you thought it was morning. The lie hit me like a physical blow. Raphael and Carmen hadn't come by last Sunday. I'd spent the entire day waiting for them, had even made extra food just in case they changed their minds about dinner. I'd been dressed and ready since early morning, hoping they might surprise me. That never happened, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling that had started in my hands. You didn't come by last Sunday. You canceled dinner because of Carmen's headache. The second man, the one with the mustache, made a note on his clipboard. Carmen's expression shifted to one of patient concern, the kind you might use with a confused child. See, she said softly to the men. This is exactly what I was talking about. The memory issues are getting worse. I felt the world tilt slightly, like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. These were lies, obvious and cruel lies, but Carmen was telling them with such conviction that I began to doubt my own memories for a terrifying moment. Had they come by? Had I answered the door in my nightgown? Was I losing my mind and didn't even know it? But then I remembered the tres leches cake still sitting in my refrigerator, the one I'd made specifically for Sunday dinner that never happened. I remembered checking my appearance in the hallway mirror 3 times that morning, making sure my hair was neat and my dress was pressed. I remembered the disappointment that had settled in my chest as the afternoon stretched on and the phone never rang. I want to call Raphael, I said firmly. I want to speak to my son. Carmen's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Of course, honey. But he's in important meetings all day. You know how demanding his job at the accounting firm has become since his promotion. Raphael had been promoted to senior partner 6 months ago, achievement that had filled me with such pride. He'd worked so hard to build his practice, often calling me late at night to talk through difficult cases or celebrate small victories, but lately those calls had become less frequent, and when we did speak, Carmen was usually in the background, reminding him of other obligations. The man with glasses cleared his throat. Mrs. Martinez, we're here to conduct a wellness check and property assessment. With your permission, we'd like to examine the interior of the home to ensure it meets basic safety standards. And if I don't give permission? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Then we'll have to schedule a formal evaluation with a court order, Carmen said quickly. Which would be much more invasive and stressful for everyone involved. Wouldn't it be easier to just let them take a quick look around? If everything's fine, they'll note that in their report, and we can all stop worrying. The logic seemed sound, but every instinct I possessed was screaming danger. Harold used to say I had a 6th sense about people, that I could smell trouble before it walked through the door. Standing there on my own front porch, I felt that familiar prickle of warning along my spine. But what?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Choice did I have? If I refused, they'd come back with legal authority. If I cooperated, maybe I could prove that I was perfectly capable of caring for myself and my property. Fine, I said, stepping aside to let them enter. But I want everything documented. I want to know exactly what you're looking for and what you find. Carmen squeezed my shoulder as she passed, a gesture that might have looked affectionate to the caseworkers, but felt like a warning to me. Of course, Mama Urs. We just want what's best for you. The interior of my house was exactly as I'd left it that morning. The dishes from my breakfast were washed and put away, the living room was dusted and organized, and fresh flowers from my garden sat in a vase on the kitchen table. The men moved through the rooms methodically, taking photographs and making notes, while Carmen followed behind, occasionally pointing out what she called areas of concern. See how the carpet is worn here by the stairs? She said to the man with the mustache. I worry about her tripping, and look at this loose handrail. So dangerous for someone her age. I watched in growing horror as she systematically cataloged minor wear and tear as evidence of negligence or inability. The worn carpet was simply the result of 42 years of family life. The handrail had been loose for months, but Harold had always handled home repairs, and I'd been meaning to call someone to fix it. The electrical outlets in the kitchen don't have safety covers, Carmen continued, pointing to the standard outlets I'd been using safely for decades. And I noticed the smoke detector in the hallway was beeping last time I was here. When was the last time you changed the battery, Urs? I couldn't remember the last time the smoke detector had beeped, and I certainly didn't remember Carmen mentioning it. But under the scrutiny of the two men with their clipboards and cameras, every normal aspect of my home began to feel like evidence against me. In the basement, things got worse. The man with glasses noted that the stairs were steep and poorly lit, that there were boxes stored near the water heater, and that the overall space seemed, quote, cluttered and potentially hazardous. These were the same basement stairs I'd been navigating safely for 4 decades, the same storage area where I kept Christmas decorations and photo albums, and the remnants of a life well lived. Mrs. Martinez, the man said, his voice gentle but firm, we're going to recommend a comprehensive evaluation by a geriatric specialist. In the meantime, we strongly suggest arranging for some assistance with daily activities and home maintenance. I don't need assistance, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I've been taking care of this house and myself perfectly well. My doctor gives me a clean bill of health every year. I drive, I cook, I manage my own finances. Carmen stepped forward, her expression a perfect mask of loving concern. That's another thing I wanted to mention. I've noticed some irregularities with her bill paying. Last month, she paid the electric bill twice and forgot about the water bill entirely. And she's been getting calls from telemarketers asking about charitable donations. I'm worried someone might be taking advantage of her generosity. This was another lie, more elaborate and harder to disprove immediately. I kept meticulous records of my bills, had never missed a payment, and was far too suspicious of strangers to fall for telephone scams. But how could I prove that standing in my basement, while 2 county employees documented every perceived flaw in my living situation? The inspection lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time the men finished their documentation and prepared to leave, I felt violated and exhausted. They handed me a thick packet of papers explaining my rights and the next steps in their evaluation process, along with a list of recommended services for elderly residents living alone. We'll be in touch within the week, the man with glasses said as they packed up their equipment. In the meantime, please consider the suggestions we've discussed today. Carmen lingered, after they left, helping herself to coffee from my kitchen, as if nothing unusual had happened. She settled into Harold's favorite chair, the blue recliner, where he'd read his evening paper for 25 years, and looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as false sympathy. I know that was difficult, she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with one of my good silver spoons. But it's for the best. You can't keep living in denial about what's happening. What's happening, I said carefully, is that you've told lies to government officials about my mental state and living conditions. What I don't understand is why. Carmen's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something calculating in her expression before the concerned daughter-in-law persona snapped back into place. Urs, I love you like my own mother. But you're not seeing things clearly anymore. Raphael and I have been worried sick about you rattling around in this big house all alone. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? Who would find you? These were legitimate concerns, the same ones that kept me awake some nights when the house seemed too quiet and my own mortality felt too close. But they weren't Carmen's concerns to voice, and they certainly weren't grounds for involving social services without my knowledge or consent. If Raphael is worried, why isn't he here? I asked. Why didn't he call me himself? Carmen's smile turned sad, almost pitying. He didn't want to hurt your feelings. You know how sensitive you can be about your independence. He thought it would be easier coming from me, woman to woman. The condescension in her voice sparked something hot and angry in my chest. Sensitive about my independence? I'd been independent since I was 16 years old, working my way through night school while caring for my sick mother. I'd helped Harold build his construction business from nothing, raised 3 children on a tight budget, and managed a household through economic ups and downs that would have broken weaker people. "I want to call Raphael now," I said, reaching for the phone on the kitchen counter. Carmen moved quickly, placing her hand over mine before I could lift the receiver. "He's really not available today, Urs, but I promise I'll have him call you tonight." Her grip on my hand was firmer than necessary, and for the first time I felt a flutter of real fear. This woman, who had eaten at my table and called me mama and cried happy tears at her wedding, was actively preventing me from speaking to my own son. "Carmen," I said quietly, "let go of my hand." She released me immediately, but the damage was done. The balance of power in my own kitchen had shifted, and we both knew it. "I should go," she said, standing and smoothing down her skirt. "I have a few more errands to run. But Urs, please think about what those men said today. Think about whether this big house is really the best place for you anymore." She gathered her purse and headed for the door, pausing to look back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Oh, and Urs? I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention our visit to anyone else just yet. Raphael wants to handle this as a family matter. Keep it private until we figure out the best solution. You understand." It wasn't really a question, and the tone of her voice made it clear that my understanding wasn't optional. After she left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me and trying to process what had just happened. The packet of papers from Adult Protective Services sat on my counter like a ticking bomb. I read through them carefully, noting the dates and times of reported incidents that had never occurred, the descriptions of my home that painted it as a hazardous environment, and the recommendations for immediate intervention. According to these documents, I was a confused elderly woman living in dangerous conditions who posed a risk to herself and potentially others. The bureaucratic language was cold and clinical, transforming my life into a case study of decline and negligence. But I wasn't confused, and I wasn't negligent. What I was, I realized with growing clarity, was being systematically undermined by someone who had eaten my food and called me family. The question was why? What did Carmen gain by portraying me as incompetent? What was the endgame of this elaborate deception? I thought about her expensive new clothes, the French perfume, the way she'd cataloged every minor flaw in my house as if she'd been studying them for months. I thought about Raphael's increasing distance, his missed calls and canceled dinners, always with Carmen's explanations smoothing over the disappointments. And then I thought about my house, my beautiful blue house on Maple Street, that Harold had painted every 5 years like clockwork, where property values had been climbing steadily as the neighborhood gentrified around us. The house that would be worth a significant sum to the right buyer. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. This wasn't about my welfare or my safety. This was about my property. Carmen wanted my house. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself pacing through the rooms with new eyes, seeing not the comfortable home where I'd spent most of my adult life, but the valuable asset it represented. The hardwood floors Harold had refinished twice, the updated kitchen we'd saved 3 years to renovate, the large lot with mature trees that developers would covet. In a neighborhood where smaller, run-down houses were selling for twice what Harold and I had paid for this place, my property was worth more than I'd ever imagined, worth enough to justify an elaborate scheme to have me declared incompetent. The phone rang just after 6, startling me out of my dark thoughts. I answered on the second ring, hoping desperately to hear Raphael's voice. "Mama?" It was him, but he sounded tired and distant. "Mijo," I said, relief flooding through me. "I'm so glad you called. We need to talk about what happened today." There was a pause, and I heard muffled voices in the background before Raphael came back on the line. "Carmen told me about the inspection. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but she said it went well. That you were very cooperative." The careful neutrality in his voice told me everything I needed to know about who had been shaping his understanding of the situation. "Raphael, they're recommending that I can't live independently anymore, based on lies Carmen told them. I need you to help me fight this." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of patient exasperation that I'd never heard directed at me before. "Mom, Nobody's trying to hurt you. We're just worried about you living alone in that big house. Maybe it's time to consider some alternatives. Alternatives. The word hung between us like a blade. I thought of all the phone calls over the years when Raphael had shared his dreams and fears with me. When he'd asked for advice about everything from job interviews to marriage proposals. When had I become someone whose concerns could be dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman? What kind of alternatives? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. There are some really nice senior communities nearby. Places where you'd have people around, activities, help if you need it. Carmen's been researching options. Of course she had. I pictured her sitting at her computer, calculating the difference between my property value and the cost of assisted living, tallying up the potential profit from my displacement. I don't want to live in a senior community, I said firmly. I want to live in my own home, the one your father and I built our life in. I know it's hard to think about change, Raphael said, and his tone was so gentle, so patronizing, that it made my chest ache. But sometimes we have to do what's best for our safety, even when it's not what we want. Our safety. As if my desire to remain in my own home was somehow selfish and dangerous. Raphael, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I do not need assistance with daily living. What I need is for my son to trust that I know my own mind and respect my ability to make my own decisions. Silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. Mom, he said finally, Carmen loves you. We both do. But love sometimes means making hard choices. After he hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and cried for the first time since his funeral. Not just for my own situation, but for the loss of my son's trust, for the family dinners that would never happen again, for the grandbabies I might never get to spoil. But underneath the grief, something harder was taking shape. Harold used to say that the Martinez women were descended from conquistadors and revolutionaries, that we might be small but we were mighty when cornered. Sitting in that chair where my husband had planned his business strategies and worried over his family's future, I began to plan my own strategy. If Carmen wanted a fight, I would give her one. But it would be on my terms, with weapons she didn't know I possessed. The next morning, I woke before dawn and began to gather documentation. Bank statements, medical records, property deeds, tax returns. Every piece of paper that proved my competency and stability. I called my doctor's office and scheduled a comprehensive physical and mental health evaluation, requesting copies of all results. I also called my lawyer, George Hendricks, who had handled Harold's estate and still sent me Christmas cards every year. His secretary said he could see me that afternoon. George's office was in an old brick building downtown, the kind of place that smelled like leather and wood polish and inspired confidence. He was in his 70s himself, with wild white hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. "Urs," he said, standing to embrace me when his secretary showed me in. "You look wonderful. How are you managing?" I sat in the chair across from his massive oak desk and told him everything. About Carmen's lies, the APS investigation, Raphael's growing distance, and my growing suspicion that this was all about my property. George listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with the same sharp attention I remembered from our meetings after Harold's death. "Urs," he said finally, "what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. It's more common than people realize, and family members are often the perpetrators." The clinical term for what I'd suspected made it feel more real, and somehow more frightening. "What can I do?" I asked. George pulled out a thick file from his cabinet. "First, we're going to make sure all your legal documents are in order and protected. Power of attorney, will, trust documents if necessary. Second, we're going to document everything that's happened so far. Third, we're going to prepare for the possibility that this situation will escalate." "Escalate how?" His expression was grim. "If someone is determined to have you declared incompetent, they have several legal avenues available: guardianship proceedings, conservatorship hearings. With the right documentation and testimony, they could potentially gain control over your finances and living situation." The room seemed to spin slightly. Even if I'm perfectly competent? Competency can be subjective, especially when it comes to elderly individuals. A sympathetic judge, some convincing testimony about memory issues or unsafe living conditions, and suddenly your autonomy is in someone else's hands. I thought about Carmen's performance for the APS workers, her careful documentation of every minor flaw in my house, her convincing portrayal of a concerned daughter-in-law worried about her elderly relative. "How long do I have?" I asked. George consulted his calendar. "If they file for emergency guardianship, claiming you're in immediate danger, we could be in court within weeks. If they go the standard route, we might have a few months to prepare our defense. A few months to prove that I deserve to keep control of my own life." The injustice of it was breathtaking. We spent the next 2 hours going over my assets, my medical history, and my legal options. George recommended a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations, a financial advisor who could help protect my assets, and a private investigator who might be able to document Carmen's true motivations. "This isn't going to be easy or cheap," George warned as I prepared to leave. "Legal fights against family members can get very ugly very quickly." I thought about Harold, about the house we'd built together, about the garden where his tomatoes still grew every summer. "George," I said, "I've been fighting for what matters to me my whole life. I'm not about to stop now." That evening, I called my daughter Maria in Phoenix. She was my middle child, a nurse practitioner with 3 teenagers and a sensible head on her shoulders. I'd been hesitant to involve her, not wanting to burden her with family drama, but I was beginning to realize I needed allies. "Mom?" Maria's voice was filled with immediate concern. "Is everything okay? You never call this late." I told her everything, watching the sunset fade through my kitchen window as I spoke. When I finished, there was a long silence. "That bitch?" Maria said finally, her voice flat with anger. "I never liked her, but I never imagined she'd do something like this." The relief of having someone believe me, someone who knew me well enough to recognize the lies, nearly brought me to tears again. "What do you need me to do?" Maria asked. "I need you to be prepared to testify about my mental state if this goes to court, and I need you to document any conversations you have with Raphael or Carmen from now on. Consider it done. And Mom, I'm proud of you for fighting this. Dad would be too." After we hung up, I felt less alone than I had in weeks. I had George, I had Maria, and I had the truth on my side. It would have to be enough. The following week passed quietly, too quietly. Carmen didn't call or visit, Raphael didn't return my messages, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. I used the time to follow George's advice, gathering medical records and financial statements, preparing for whatever came next. Then, on Thursday afternoon, everything changed. I was in the basement, looking for my marriage certificate in the filing cabinet where Harold had kept all our important papers, when I heard the front door open. I called out, thinking it might be the mailman with a package, but got no response. Footsteps moved through the house above me, too heavy to be mine, too purposeful to be casual. I called out again, louder this time, and heard voices, multiple voices. My heart began to race as I climbed the basement stairs, my arthritic knees protesting with each step. At the top, I found the basement door had been closed and locked from the outside. I pounded on the door with both fists, shouting to be let out, demanding to know who was in my house. The voices above me continued their conversation, but no one responded to my calls. For nearly an hour I banged on that door and called for help, my voice growing hoarse and my hands growing sore. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching the basement door. "Hello?" I called out, pressing my ear to the wood. "Please, let me out. This is my house." The footsteps paused, and then I heard Carmen's voice, muffled but clear. "I'm sorry, Urs, but this is for your own good." The footsteps moved away, and I heard the front door close. A car engine started in my driveway and faded into the distance. I was alone, locked in my own basement, with no way to call for help, and no idea when someone might find me. The basement was cool and dimly lit, with only one small window that faced the backyard. I tried the door again, throwing my shoulder against it despite the pain in my joints, but it was solid wood and wouldn't budge. The filing cabinet I'd been searching through contained a lifetime of memories and documents, but nothing that would help me escape. I found a screwdriver in Harold's old toolbox and tried to remove the door hinges, but they were on the other side, out of reach. As the hours passed and daylight faded from the small window, I began to understand the full scope of Carmen's plan. By tomorrow, when concerned neighbors or delivery people found me confused and helpless in my own basement, I would look exactly like the incompetent elderly woman she'd described to social services. How long had I been missing? Who had been in my house? What story would Carmen tell about discovering me like this? I thought about Raphael, about whether he knew what his wife had done, or if he genuinely believed he was helping his confused mother. I thought about Maria, who wouldn't expect to hear from me for days and had no reason to worry. I thought about George, who might not realize I was missing until our next appointment. But mostly, I thought about Harold, about the promises we'd made to each other to fight for our family and our home, no matter what challenges came our way. He'd faced down unscrupulous contractors and dishonest business partners, had stood up to anyone who tried to take advantage of what we'd worked to build. Sitting on that cold concrete floor, my back against the wall and my knees drawn up to conserve warmth, I made my own promise. If I got out of this basement, I would fight back with everything I had. Carmen wanted to play games with my life and my home? She was about to learn that this old woman had more fight in her than she'd bargained for. The night stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of the house settling above me and my own breathing in the darkness. I dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to the reality of my situation. But with each hour that passed, my resolve grew stronger. By morning, I wasn't just angry. I was dangerous. Dawn light filtered through the basement window, gray and weak but enough to see by. I'd spent the night planning, thinking through every detail of what I would do when I got out. Because I would get out. Carmen had made a critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed that a 73-year-old woman would break under pressure, would accept defeat, would crawl away quietly to whatever fate she'd planned. She was about to discover just how wrong she was. The sound of footsteps above me came just after 8 in the morning. Multiple sets again, along with voices I didn't recognize. I heard my front door open and close several times, the sounds of people moving furniture, and conversations too muffled to understand. Then, finally, footsteps approached the basement door. "Mrs. Martinez?" An unfamiliar voice called out. "Are you down there?" I pressed my face close to the door. "Yes. Please, let me out. I've been trapped here all night." I heard the scrape of something being moved away from the door, then the click of the lock being turned. The door swung open, and I found myself looking up at a uniformed police officer, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. Behind him stood Carmen, her face a perfect mask of shocked worry, and 2 paramedics with a gurney. "Oh my God, Urs!" Carmen exclaimed, pushing past the officer to kneel beside me. "Thank goodness you're all right. When you didn't answer your phone this morning, I got so worried. The performance was flawless." Her voice shook with what sounded like genuine relief, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her hands trembled as she reached out to help me stand. But I had spent the night thinking, planning, and I was ready for this moment. "Officer," I said clearly, looking directly at the policeman, while ignoring Carmen's outstretched hands. "I need to report a crime. I was locked in this basement against my will by someone who had unauthorized access to my home." Carmen's expression flickered for just an instant before the concerned mask snapped back into place. "Urs, honey, you're confused," she said gently. "You called me last night, remember? You said you were going down to the basement to look for something and you were worried about getting lost down there. I told you to wait until I could come help you, but when I got here this morning, the door was locked and you couldn't remember how to open it." It was a good story, plausible and consistent, with the narrative of confusion and incompetence she'd been building. But I had anticipated this moment during the long hours of the night. "Officer," I said, struggling to my feet without Carmen's assistance, "I'd like to show you something." I led them to Harold's workbench, where I'd spent much of the night preparing. Using his tools and materials, I'd managed to scratch a message into the concrete wall, deep enough to be permanent and detailed enough to be credible. Thursday, 6:17 p.m., locked in by C. Martinez. Thursday, 11:43 p.m., No food or water. Friday, 3:22 a.m., still trapped. The timestamps continued through the night, documenting my imprisonment hour by hour. The officer studied the scratches carefully, then looked at Carmen with new interest. "Ma'am," he said, "can you explain how Mrs. Martinez would have been able to create these markings if she was simply confused about opening the door?" Carmen's composure cracked slightly. She must have done that after I left last night, when she realized she was stuck." "With what?" I asked quietly. "I'm 73 years old with arthritis in both hands. Do you really think I could scratch concrete deep enough to leave permanent marks using my fingernails?" I showed the officer Harold's screwdriver, now worn and marked from hours of work. It took me most of the night to carve those marks. Every letter, every number. Because I knew someone would claim I was confused, and I needed proof of what really happened here. The basement fell silent, except for the hum of the water heater. The officer looked from me to Carmen and back again, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Martinez," he said finally, "would you like to file a formal complaint?" Carmen stepped forward quickly. "Officer, please understand that Mrs. Martinez has been experiencing some cognitive issues lately. We've been working with Adult Protective Services because of concerns about her ability to live safely on her own. I think what happened here was a tragic misunderstanding, not a deliberate act. Her recovery was smooth and practiced, but I was ready for this too." "Officer," I said, "I'd like to request that you document the condition of this door and lock. I'd also like you to note that the person claiming I'm cognitively impaired somehow had keys to my house and was able to access it without my permission or knowledge." The questions that followed were uncomfortable for Carmen. How had she gotten into the house? Where had she gotten keys? Why hadn't she called the police immediately when she couldn't reach me? Her answers became increasingly convoluted, and I watched the officer's expression grow more skeptical with each response. "I have spare keys because I help Urs with errands sometimes," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "And I didn't call police right away because I thought maybe she was just sleeping deeply or had her hearing aid turned off." The officer made careful notes, photographed the scratched messages on the concrete wall, and documented the condition of the basement door and lock. When the paramedics checked my vital signs and found me physically unharmed but dehydrated, Carmen suggested they take me to the hospital for observation. "Just to be safe," she said with renewed conviction. "After spending the night in a cold basement, who knows what kind of health complications might develop?" But I had learned to recognize her tactics now. The hospital would mean more opportunities for her to paint me as frail and confused, more chances for medical professionals to recommend supervised care. "I'm declining medical treatment," I told the paramedics firmly. "I'm going to stay in my own home and call my doctor if I have any concerns." Carmen's mask slipped again, just for a moment, but long enough for me to see the flash of frustration in her eyes. After the police and paramedics left, promising to file a report about the incident, Carmen lingered in my kitchen. She made herself coffee without asking, a presumption that would have seemed normal just weeks ago but now felt like a violation. "Urs," she said, settling into Harold's chair once again, "I know you're upset about what happened, but you have to understand that everyone is just trying to help you." I remained standing, unwilling to sit down and create the illusion of a friendly conversation. "Help me with what, exactly?" I asked. "With accepting that you need more support than this house can provide? Last night proved that living alone isn't safe for you anymore." The audacity of her statement took my breath away. She had created the dangerous situation she was now using as evidence against me. "Carmen," I said carefully, "are you telling me that you deliberately locked me in the basement to prove I couldn't live safely on my own?" Her laugh was bright and dismissive. "Of course not. I'm saying that your confusion led to a dangerous situation that could have ended much worse. What if you'd fallen down those stairs? What if you'd had a heart attack from the stress?" Each hypothetical scenario she described was delivered with such concern, such apparent love, that anyone listening might have believed she genuinely cared about my welfare. But I had spent the night in that basement, and I knew the truth. "I want you to leave," I said quietly. "Urs. Now. And I want my house keys back." Carmen's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. I think you're making a mistake. Raphael is going to be very concerned when he hears about what happened last night. The threat was subtle but clear. Whatever story she told Raphael would paint me as the problem, not her. Then he and I will have a conversation about it, I replied. After you leave. She finished her coffee slowly, making it clear that she was leaving on her own terms, not because I'd asked her to. At the door, she turned back with one final performance of loving concern. Promise me you'll think about what we discussed, about getting the help you need. I'd hate for something worse to happen. After she left, I stood in my empty house and felt the full weight of what I was up against. Carmen wasn't just trying to manipulate me into leaving my home. She was systematically building a case that would legally justify removing me. The basement incident would become evidence of my confusion and poor judgment. The police report would document my tendency to create dangerous situations. Every detail would be twisted to support her narrative. But she had underestimated me in one crucial way. The night in the basement hadn't broken my spirit. It had clarified my purpose. I now understood exactly what I was fighting for, and exactly what I was fighting against. I called George immediately and arranged an emergency meeting. Then I called Maria and told her about the basement incident, asking her to document our conversation with dates and times. Finally, I called my doctor and scheduled the comprehensive evaluation George had recommended. But first I had something more immediate to do. I got my purse, put on my good walking shoes, and left the house for the first time since the basement incident. The morning air felt crisp and clean after the stale atmosphere of the basement, and my legs, though stiff from the night on concrete, carried me steadily down Maple Street toward downtown. Riverside Community Bank sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, in a red brick building that had housed the town's financial heart for over 60 years. Harold and I had opened our first joint account there as newlyweds, had gotten our mortgage there, had celebrated every financial milestone of our marriage within those familiar walls. The lobby was quiet at mid-morning, with only a few customers conducting business at the teller windows. I walked directly to the customer service desk and asked to speak with someone about protecting my accounts. The young woman who assisted me was named Jennifer, and she had the kind of professional competence that inspired confidence. When I explained that I was concerned about potential financial exploitation by family members, she listened without judgment and took detailed notes. Mrs. Martinez, she said when I finished, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than people realize. We have several options for protecting your assets while ensuring you maintain full control over your finances. She explained fraud alerts, dual signature requirements, and designated trusted contacts who could be notified of unusual account activity. More importantly, she helped me establish a paper trail that would document my mental competency and financial awareness. If someone ever tries to claim you're not capable of managing your own money, Jennifer said, we'll have extensive documentation proving otherwise. We spent over an hour reviewing my accounts, updating my contact information, and establishing new security protocols. When I left the bank, I carried with me not just enhanced protection for my assets, but something more valuable: evidence that I was a competent, engaged individual taking reasonable steps to protect myself. The walk home gave me time to think about my next moves. Carmen's plan depended on painting me as confused and vulnerable, but every action I took to protect myself weakened that narrative. The police report would show that I had been clear-thinking enough to document my imprisonment. The bank records would prove my financial competency. The medical evaluation would demonstrate my mental acuity. But I also knew that Carmen wasn't finished. The basement incident had been a test, a way to gauge my response and adjust her strategy accordingly. She would be back with something more sophisticated, more convincing. I was right. That evening, Raphael called just as I was finishing a simple dinner of soup and toast. His voice carried a weight of concern that immediately put me on guard. Mom, Carmen told me what happened last night. Are you okay? I chose my words carefully. I'm fine now, but I was locked in the basement for nearly 14 hours without food, water, or any way to call for help. She said you called her confused about being stuck down there, that you couldn't figure out how to open the door. The version of events Carmen had given him was predictably different from reality. Raphael, I said firmly, I did not call Carmen last night. I was locked in that basement against my will by someone who had unauthorized access to our house. Silence stretched between us. When Raphael spoke again, his voice carried a note of gentle exasperation that broke my heart. "Mom, the police said there was no sign of forced entry. Carmen has keys because she helps you with things. Maybe you just got confused about what happened." The carefully planted seeds of doubt were already taking root in my son's mind. Every reasonable explanation Carmen had provided was being accepted as truth, while my version of events was dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman. "Did you know she's been telling lies to Adult Protective Services about my mental state?" I asked. Another pause. "She mentioned that she had some concerns about you living alone." "Mom, that's not lying. That's caring about your safety." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that Raphael's perception of reality had been thoroughly shaped by Carmen's influence. Every concern I raised was met with gentle dismissal. Every piece of evidence I presented was reframed as proof of my declining judgment. After we hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and faced a terrible truth. I was losing my son, not to death or distance, but to manipulation so skillful that he genuinely believed he was acting in my best interests. The next few days passed in an uneasy calm. I didn't hear from Carmen or Raphael, which somehow felt more ominous than their active interference. I used the time to continue building my defense, meeting with the geriatric psychiatrist George had recommended, and gathering character references from neighbors and longtime friends. Dr. Sarah Kim was a small, precise woman with kind eyes and an impressive array of credentials. Her evaluation was thorough and professional, consisting of cognitive tests, memory assessments, and detailed questions about my daily routines and decision-making processes. "Mrs. Martinez," she said when we finished, "you show no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. Your memory is excellent, your judgment is sound, and your ability to manage your own affairs is well within normal ranges for someone your age." The relief I felt at having an expert confirm what I already knew was overwhelming. Dr. Kim's report would be crucial evidence if Carmen's scheme proceeded to court. "However," she continued, "I want you to understand that competency evaluations can be subjective. Different doctors might reach different conclusions, especially if they're presented with biased information about your behavior or living situation." The warning was sobering. Even with expert testimony on my side, the legal system could still be manipulated by someone determined enough to exploit its weaknesses. I also met with Frank Morrison, the private investigator George had recommended. Frank was a retired police detective in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a methodical approach that reminded me of Harold's way of solving problems. "Mrs. Martinez," he said after reviewing my situation, "what you're dealing with is classic financial elder abuse. The perpetrator isolates the victim, undermines their credibility, and positions themselves as the concerned family member trying to help." Frank explained how these schemes typically progressed, from initial manipulation to legal guardianship proceedings to complete control over the victim's assets. "The good news," he said, "is that you recognized what was happening early and you're fighting back. Most victims don't realize they're being targeted until it's too late." He agreed to begin investigating Carmen's background, her financial situation, and any connections she might have to other elder abuse cases. The investigation would take time, but it might provide crucial evidence about her true motivations. A week after the basement incident, the other shoe dropped. I was in my garden, harvesting the last tomatoes of the season, when I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked across the street. A woman in a dark suit sat behind the wheel, occasionally lifting what looked like a camera or binoculars. When I waved, she looked away and started her engine. The surveillance continued for 3 days. Different cars, different people, but always someone watching my house during daylight hours. They were careful not to be obvious about it, but Harold had taught me to notice details, and I could feel their eyes on me whenever I stepped outside. On Thursday morning, the watchers were joined by something more official. A van from Riverside County Social Services parked directly in front of my house. 2 women in professional attire knocked on my door at exactly 9 o'clock. One was middle-aged with graying hair and a clipboard, the other younger with earnest eyes and a briefcase full of forms. "Mrs. Martinez? I'm Linda Walsh from Adult Protective Services. And this is my colleague, Patricia Chen. We need to conduct a follow-up assessment based on recent reports of safety concerns. I invited them in, but my stomach was already clenching with familiar dread. This felt different from the previous inspection, more formal and less open to discussion. We've received additional information suggesting that your living situation may be unsafe, Linda Walsh continued as they settled in my living room. There was an incident last week involving you being trapped in your basement for an extended period. Yes, I said carefully. I was locked in my basement against my will by someone who had unauthorized access to my home. I filed a police report about the incident. Patricia Chen made a note on her form. Can you tell us about the circumstances that led to you being in the basement? I explained about looking for documents in Harold's filing cabinet, about hearing people in the house, about finding the door locked when I tried to leave. I showed them the scratched messages I'd carved into the concrete wall, explained how I'd documented my imprisonment hour by hour. The two women exchanged glances that I couldn't quite interpret. Mrs. Martinez, Linda Walsh said gently, we've spoken with your daughter-in-law about this incident. She's provided a different account of what happened. Of course she had. According to Mrs. Carmen Martinez, you called her on Thursday evening expressing confusion about being in the basement. You told her you had gone down to look for something, but couldn't remember what it was or how to get back upstairs. The lie was more elaborate this time, more detailed and harder to refute immediately. She says she advised you to stay put until she could come help you, but when she arrived the next morning, you seemed disoriented and couldn't explain how you'd spent the night. Patricia Chen leaned forward with an expression of professional sympathy. Mrs. Martinez, episodes of confusion and disorientation can be very frightening, but they're also warning signs that you might need additional support. I felt the familiar sensation of reality being twisted around me, of truth becoming subjective, and my own experiences being dismissed as symptoms of decline. I did not call Carmen Thursday evening, I said firmly. I have phone records that will prove that. I also have medical and psychological evaluations that confirm my mental competency. Linda Walsh nodded as if she were humoring a difficult child. We'll certainly review any documentation you'd like to provide. But Mrs. Martinez, we're also concerned about your ability to accurately assess your own condition. The circular logic was maddening. Any evidence I provided of my competency could be dismissed as proof that I lacked the judgment to recognize my own impairment. The assessment continued for 2 hours. They photographed every room, documented every potential hazard, and asked detailed questions about my daily routines. When they finished, their conclusion felt inevitable. Mrs. Martinez, we're recommending immediate intervention. Your living situation poses significant risks to your health and safety, and recent incidents suggest that your judgment may be compromised. The formal language couldn't disguise what they were really saying. They were going to try to remove me from my home. What kind of intervention? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. We're filing a petition for emergency guardianship, Patricia Chen said, her voice kind but implacable. A court-appointed guardian will be able to make decisions about your care and living situation in your best interests. Emergency guardianship. The words hit me like a physical blow. I would have no time to prepare, no opportunity to gather evidence or arrange legal representation. Carmen's plan was accelerating, moving toward its conclusion with terrifying efficiency. You'll receive notice of the court hearing, Linda Walsh continued. Until then, we strongly recommend that you arrange for someone to stay with you, for your own safety. After they left, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the official papers they'd given me. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, just 5 days away. 5 days to prove that I deserved to keep control of my own life. I called George immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "Urs," he said as soon as he heard my voice. "What's happened?" I told him about the social services visit, about the emergency guardianship petition, about the 5-day deadline we were facing. "We can fight this," George said firmly. "But we need to move fast. I'll file a response and request a full competency hearing with independent medical evaluation. We'll present Dr. Kim's assessment, your bank records, and character testimony from friends and neighbors." The legal strategy sounded solid, but I could hear the concern in George's voice. Emergency guardianship proceedings were designed to move quickly, with minimal opportunity for the subject to mount a defense. "George," I said quietly, "what are my real chances?" He was silent for a long moment. "If the judge is predisposed to err on the side of caution, if Carmen presents well in court, if the social services recommendation carries significant weight." His voice trailed off. "You're saying I might lose." "I'm saying we have a fight ahead of us. But you're not going down without a battle. And sometimes, that's enough to change the outcome." That evening, I called Maria and told her about the guardianship petition. She was furious, using language I hadn't heard from my daughter since her teenage years. "I'm flying out tomorrow," she said without hesitation. "I'll testify, I'll bring character witnesses, I'll do whatever it takes." The support meant everything to me, but I also knew that Carmen had been building her case for months, while I'd only recently understood what I was fighting against. I spent that night going through Harold's papers again, looking for anything that might help my case. In the back of his filing cabinet, I found something I'd forgotten about. A folder labeled Home Improvements, containing receipts and photographs documenting every renovation and repair we'd made to the house over 4 decades. The pictures showed a progression of careful maintenance and thoughtful upgrades. New roof in 1995, updated electrical system in 2003, kitchen renovation in 2018. Each improvement represented not just money invested, but love and commitment to our home. But more importantly, the folder contained something else. Detailed financial records showing exactly how much we'd spent on the house and what it had cost us to maintain. Numbers that would demonstrate my long-term financial planning and responsible property management. As I studied the documents by lamplight, a new understanding began to form. I had been approaching this fight defensively, trying to prove that I wasn't the confused, incompetent woman Carmen claimed I was. But perhaps it was time to go on the offense. Carmen wanted my house. She'd built an elaborate scheme to get it, involving lies, manipulation, and legal proceedings. But what she'd failed to consider was that the house represented more than just valuable property. It represented a lifetime of careful planning, responsible management, and deep emotional investment. I might be 73 years old. I might be facing a legal system designed to protect people like me by taking away their autonomy. But I wasn't defenseless. I had documentation, I had allies, and I had something Carmen couldn't fake or manipulate: genuine love for this place and everything it represented. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing legal documents when I heard a car in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Raphael getting out of his sedan. Alone for the first time in months. My heart leaped with hope. Maybe Carmen's hold on him was weakening. Maybe he was finally ready to hear my side of the story. But when I opened the door, the expression on his face told me I was wrong. "Mom," he said heavily, "we need to talk." He looked older than his 35 years, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights. But there was also something resolute in his manner, as if he'd made a difficult decision and was determined to see it through. "Of course, Mijo. Come in." We sat in the living room where he'd played as a child, where Harold had taught him to tie his shoes, and where we'd celebrated every birthday and achievement of his young life. The familiarity of the setting made what came next even more painful. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," Raphael began, his voice carefully controlled. "The social services visits, the basement incident, your increasing paranoia about Carmen. Paranoia." The word stung because it dismissed my legitimate concerns as symptoms of mental illness. "Raphael, I'm not paranoid. I'm responding rationally to a real threat." He shook his head sadly. "Mom, Carmen loves you. We both do. But you're seeing conspiracies where there's only concern. I watched my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized that Carmen's manipulation had been even more thorough than I'd understood. She hadn't just convinced him that I was incompetent. She'd convinced him that my resistance to her help was proof of my decline. "The guardianship proceeding?" I said carefully. "Do you support that?" Raphael's jaw tightened. If it's what's best for your safety, yes. The answer felt like a betrayal deeper than anything Carmen could have done. This was my son, my own flesh and blood, advocating for my rights to be taken away. And who would be my guardian? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Carmen has volunteered. She has experience with elder care through her work, and she knows your needs better than anyone else. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Carmen's mysterious job that Raphael had always been vague about, her sudden expertise in elder care issues, her familiarity with social services procedures. She had been planning this for months, maybe years, building credentials and relationships that would support her eventual takeover of my life. Raphael, I said quietly, if Carmen becomes my guardian, she'll have control over my finances, my medical decisions, and where I live. Do you understand what that means? It means you'll be safe and well cared for, he replied, but I heard doubt creeping into his voice for the first time. It means she'll sell this house and put me in a nursing home. It means I'll lose everything your father and I worked our whole lives to build. The doubt in Raphael's expression deepened, but Carmen's conditioning held firm. Maybe that's what needs to happen, he said softly. Maybe holding on to this house isn't worth the risk to your safety. We talked for another hour, but I could see that his mind was made up. Carmen had spent months carefully shaping his perceptions, feeding him a steady diet of concerns and incidents that painted me as increasingly fragile and unreliable. My protests only reinforced her narrative of confusion and stubbornness. After Raphael left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness and faced the most difficult truth of this entire ordeal. I was going to lose my son along with everything else. Even if I somehow won the legal battle, even if I proved Carmen's manipulation and protected my home, the damage to my relationship with Raphael might be irreparable. But I couldn't let that possibility stop me from fighting. Too much was at stake, and too many other elderly people might face similar schemes if Carmen succeeded. That weekend, I threw myself into preparation for Tuesday's hearing. George and I reviewed my testimony, organized my evidence, and planned our strategy. Maria arrived Sunday evening with a suitcase full of documentation and a fierce determination to protect her mother. I can't believe Raphael is going along with this, she said as we sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal papers and medical records. Carmen is very convincing, I replied, and Raphael wants to believe he's doing the right thing. Well, he's not. And I'm going to make sure the judge knows exactly what kind of person is really behind this guardianship petition. Frank Morrison, the private investigator, had been busy as well. His preliminary report revealed some interesting details about Carmen's background, including significant credit card debt and a previous job at a nursing home that had ended under suspicious circumstances. It's not enough to prove criminal intent, Frank warned, but it establishes a pattern of financial stress and questionable judgment regarding elderly care. Monday night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Harold, about the conversations we'd had in this very bedroom, about growing old together, about taking care of each other, about never giving up on what mattered most. I won't let them win. I whispered to his photograph on the nightstand. I won't let them take our home. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Harold's funeral and every important occasion since. Maria helped me organize my documents and drove me to the courthouse, both of us silent with anticipation and dread. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in Judge Morrison's courtroom. George met us in the hallway, looking professionally confident but privately concerned. "Remember," he said quietly, "answer only what you're fully asked. Don't volunteer information. Let the evidence speak for itself." Carmen was already there when we entered the courtroom, dressed impeccably and accompanied by Raphael and her own attorney. She looked every inch the concerned family member, her expression a perfect blend of sadness and determination. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and intelligent eyes. She reviewed the paperwork efficiently, then looked up at the assembled parties. "This is a petition for emergency guardianship," she said in a clear, authoritative voice. The petitioner alleges that Mrs. Ursula Martinez is unable to care for herself safely and requires immediate intervention. Mrs. Martinez, you are represented by counsel and have the right to contest this petition. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice steady, despite the pounding of my heart. What followed was the most important performance of Carmen's life, and she delivered it flawlessly. She testified about my alleged confusion, my unsafe living conditions, my inability to manage my own affairs. She presented the social services reports, the police documentation from the basement incident, and Raphael's corroborating testimony about my declining mental state. Her attorney painted a picture of a devoted daughter-in-law, reluctantly seeking legal intervention to protect an elderly woman who could no longer protect herself. Every lie was delivered with apparent sincerity, every manipulation presented as loving concern. When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of everything I'd learned about courtroom battles from Harold's business disputes. Tell the truth, stick to the facts, and trust the system to recognize justice when it saw it. I presented Dr. Kim's competency evaluation, my bank records showing responsible financial management, and character testimony from neighbors and longtime friends. I explained about the basement incident, showing photographs of the messages I'd scratched into the concrete wall and presenting evidence that I hadn't called Carmen for help. George was thorough and professional, systematically dismantling each allegation in the social services report and highlighting the inconsistencies in Carmen's testimony. But I could see in Judge Morrison's expression that we were fighting an uphill battle. Emergency guardianship proceedings were designed to err on the side of caution, and Carmen's presentation had been convincing. The hearing lasted 3 hours. When it was over, Judge Morrison retired to consider her decision, leaving us to wait in the hallway with our hearts in our throats. Whatever happens, George said quietly, you fought well, you presented a strong case. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't optimistic about the outcome. 20 minutes later, we were called back into the courtroom for Judge Morrison's decision. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, she began, this court finds that while Mrs. Martinez appears to be mentally competent, the safety concerns raised by social services and family members cannot be ignored. My heart sank. I could feel the walls of my life closing in around me. However, Judge Morrison continued, I am not convinced that full guardianship is the appropriate solution at this time. The room seemed to hold its breath. Instead, I am ordering a 6-month supervised living arrangement. Mrs. Martinez will remain in her home, but with daily check-ins from a court-appointed social worker and weekly medical evaluations. If she can demonstrate stable, safe, independent living during this period, the guardianship petition will be dismissed. It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for, but it wasn't the defeat Carmen had planned either. I would keep my home, at least temporarily, and I would have a chance to prove my competency under supervised conditions. Carmen's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught a flash of anger in her eyes before she composed herself. As we left the courthouse, I felt exhausted, but not defeated. The fight wasn't over, but I'd won the first round. Now I had 6 months to prove that I deserved to keep control of my own life. But Carmen wasn't finished with me yet. The real battle was just beginning. The supervised living arrangement began 3 days after the court hearing. My assigned social worker was an earnest young man named Kevin Torres, who knocked on my door every morning at 9 sharp with a clipboard and a nervous smile. He was fresh out of graduate school, with kind eyes and an obvious discomfort with his role as my court-appointed supervisor. Mrs. Martinez, he said during our first meeting, I want you to know that I'm here to help, not to judge. The court just wants to ensure your safety and well-being. I appreciated his gentle approach, but the daily intrusions felt like a constant reminder that my independence hung by a thread. Kevin checked my medications, examined my living conditions, and asked detailed questions about my daily activities. Every conversation was documented, every observation recorded in reports that would determine my future. The weekly medical evaluations were conducted by Dr. Patricia Barnes, a geriatrician with a brisk manner and an efficient approach to elderly patients. She tested my blood pressure, reviewed my reflexes, and asked repetitive questions about my memory and orientation. Like Kevin, she seemed genuinely interested in my well-being, but I could never forget that her assessments would weigh heavily in the court's final decision. Carmen maintained a careful distance during the first month of supervision, but her presence was felt in subtle ways. Raphael's visits became more frequent, always with gentle suggestions about my living situation and increasingly pointed observations about the burden I was placing on the court system. "Mom, all of this monitoring and evaluation," he said during one particularly uncomfortable visit, "wouldn't it be easier to just consider some of the assisted living options Carmen researched?" I was washing dishes while he sat at my kitchen table, and I kept my hands busy to avoid showing how much his words hurt. "Raphael, I'm proving every day that I can live safely on my own. My medical evaluations are perfect, my house is well maintained, and I haven't had a single incident since the court order." "But for how long?" he pressed. "You're 73 years old. Even if you win this battle, what happens when you're 80? Or 85? The questions were reasonable, the kind any loving child might ask about an aging parent. But coming from Raphael, influenced by Carmen's relentless campaign, they felt like another attack on my autonomy. "When I'm 80, if I need help, I'll ask for it," I said firmly. "But that decision will be mine to make." We had variations of this conversation during every visit, with Raphael growing more frustrated by my stubbornness and me becoming more convinced that Carmen's influence over him was permanent. It was during the second month of supervision that things began to escalate in new and frightening ways. I started noticing small changes in my house that I couldn't explain. Books moved from where I'd left them, photographs slightly askew on the mantel, kitchen utensils in different drawers than where I always kept them. The changes were subtle enough that I questioned my own memory, wondered if the stress of the court proceedings was affecting my perception. But then I found evidence that someone had been in my basement again. Harold's toolbox, which I'd left organized after the incident with Carmen, was in disarray. Tools were missing, others were in the wrong compartments, and there were fresh scratches on the concrete floor near where I'd carved my messages weeks earlier. I called Kevin immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "Kevin, someone has been in my house. They've been through my basement and moved things around upstairs." His response was gentle but skeptical. "Mrs. Martinez, are you sure? Sometimes when we're under stress, we might misplace things, or forget where we put them." The patronizing tone, however well-intentioned, made my stomach clench with familiar frustration. "I'm not confused," I said firmly. "Someone has been entering my home without permission." Kevin agreed to come over that afternoon to document my concerns, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. When he arrived, he examined the basement carefully, photographed the disturbed toolbox, and made notes about my allegations. "I don't see any signs of forced entry," he said after completing his inspection. "And your security system shows no record of unauthorized access." I hadn't mentioned that Carmen still had keys to my house. The court order didn't specifically require me to change the locks, and I'd been afraid that doing so might look paranoid or vindictive. "Mrs. Martinez," Kevin continued gently, "is it possible that you moved these items yourself and forgot? The stress of this situation could be affecting your memory in ways you might not realize." The circular logic was maddening. Any evidence I presented of intrusion could be dismissed as proof of my own confusion. Any concern I raised could be reframed as a symptom of mental decline. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed paranoid under normal circumstances but felt entirely rational, given what I was facing. I set up my own surveillance system. Using my limited knowledge of technology and some help from Maria over the phone, I positioned my old digital camera in my living room, aimed at the front door and stairs. It wasn't sophisticated, but it would at least record anyone entering the main areas of my house. The camera captured nothing for a week. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my medical appointment with Dr. Barnes, it recorded something that made my blood run cold. Carmen entered my house using her key, moving with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. She wasn't searching or stealing. She was systematically altering small details throughout my living space. She moved a lamp 3 inches to the left, rearranged the magazines on my coffee table, and switched the positions of 2 framed photographs on my mantel. But most disturbing of all, she spent nearly 20 minutes in my kitchen, doing something with my medication bottles that I couldn't see clearly from the camera's angle. I called George immediately, my voice tight with controlled anger. I have video evidence of Carmen entering my house without permission and tampering with my belongings. George's response was swift and decisive. Bring me that recording immediately. We're filing a motion to revoke her access and requesting criminal charges for trespassing. But when I tried to download the video from my camera, I discovered that the memory card was corrupted. Hours of footage, including the crucial evidence of Carmen's break-in, were irretrievably lost. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Somehow, Carmen had discovered my surveillance attempt and neutralized it. I sat in my living room that evening, staring at the useless camera and feeling more isolated than I had since Harold's death. Carmen was not just manipulating the legal system, she was playing a psychological warfare game designed to make me doubt my own sanity. But she had made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed that an elderly woman, isolated and under stress, would eventually break under the pressure of constant gaslighting and manipulation. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The next morning, I called Frank Morrison and asked him to expand his investigation into Carmen's background. I also contacted a security company and arranged for a professional alarm system with remote monitoring. If Carmen wanted to play games with my safety and sanity, I would make sure every move was documented. Mrs. Martinez, the security technician said as he installed the new system, this equipment will record everything in high definition, with automatic backup to secure servers. Nobody will be able to tamper with your footage. The installation took most of the day, but when it was finished, I felt more secure than I had in months. Motion sensors covered every entrance, cameras monitored every room, and the system would alert both me and the security company to any unauthorized access. Kevin arrived for his daily check-in just as the technicians were finishing their work. "What's all this?" he asked, eyeing the new cameras with obvious concern. "Security improvements," I said simply. "I want to ensure that my home remains safe and that any future incidents are properly documented." Kevin made careful notes about the new security system, and I could see him trying to decide whether this represented reasonable precaution or escalating paranoia. In his reports, would this appear as evidence of my competency or my decline? That question was answered sooner than I expected. Dr. Barnes reviewed Kevin's notes during my next medical evaluation and approached the topic of my security system with professional curiosity. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand you've installed extensive surveillance equipment in your home. Can you tell me what prompted this decision?" I explained about the evidence of intrusion, about items being moved and my basement being disturbed. I described the pattern of psychological manipulation I believed I was experiencing. Dr. Barnes listened without interruption, but I could see the concern growing in her expression. "Have you considered that these changes you're noticing might have innocent explanations? Sometimes, when we're under stress, we become hypervigilant about our environment. Small variations that we might normally ignore become significant sources of anxiety." The medical terminology made her skepticism sound professional and objective, but the underlying message was clear. My concerns were symptoms of psychological distress rather than legitimate responses to real threats. "Doctor," I said carefully, "I've lived in this house for 42 years. I know when someone has been moving my belongings." "I'm sure you believe that," she replied gently. "But belief and reality don't always align, especially when we're dealing with significant stressors." After she left, I reviewed her written evaluation. In careful medical language, she had documented my increasing paranoid ideation and hypervigilant behavior patterns. My security system, installed as evidence of my competency and forward thinking, had been reframed as proof of my psychological deterioration. I was beginning to understand the impossible position Carmen had created for me. Any action I took to protect myself could be interpreted as evidence of paranoia. Any evidence I presented of manipulation could be dismissed as confused thinking. The very fact that I was fighting back became proof that I needed protection from my own judgment. But Carmen wasn't finished with her psychological campaign. The medication tampering began subtly. Pills that I was certain I'd placed in my weekly dispenser would be missing when I went to take them. Bottles that I knew were nearly empty would suddenly be full again. My carefully maintained routine of morning vitamins and evening supplements became a source of constant confusion and self-doubt. I started keeping detailed logs of my medication intake, photographing my pill bottles before and after each dose. But even this precaution was turned against me when Kevin discovered my documentation during one of his visits. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, reviewing the pages of medication logs with obvious concern. "This level of detailed record-keeping seems excessive. Are you having trouble remembering whether you've taken your pills?" The question was a trap. If I said yes, it would be evidence of memory problems. If I said no, my detailed documentation would seem like compulsive behavior. "I'm keeping records to protect myself from false allegations," I said carefully. Kevin made a note that I was sure wouldn't reflect well on my mental state assessment. The psychological pressure intensified when Carmen began leaving subtle traces of her presence in my house. A different brand of coffee in my kitchen cabinet, flowers in my garden that I hadn't planted, a book on my nightstand that I'd never seen before. Each intrusion was small enough to be explained away, but collectively they created a constant sense of violation and uncertainty. I began to question my own memory, wondering if stress really was affecting my perception of reality. But the security system I'd installed captured everything. Night after night, the cameras recorded Carmen entering my house with her key, making small alterations designed to undermine my sense of security and sanity. She was skilled at avoiding the most obvious camera angles, but the motion sensors tracked her movements throughout the house. The footage showed a pattern of deliberate psychological manipulation that would have been impossible to explain as coincidence or innocent behavior. Carmen was systematically attempting to drive me toward a psychological breakdown that would justify her guardianship petition. I compiled hours of video evidence and brought it to George, expecting finally to have the proof we needed to expose Carmen's scheme. But George's response was more cautious than I'd anticipated. "This is compelling evidence," he said after reviewing the footage, "but we need to be careful about how we present it. Carmen still has legal access to your house, and a judge might view your surveillance as excessive rather than protective. The legal system's bias toward family members, even manipulative ones, meant that even video evidence of Carmen's intrusions might be dismissed as overreaction on my part." "What are my options?" I asked. "We can file for a restraining order and request that her access to your home be revoked. But that will likely trigger an immediate guardianship hearing, and Carmen will argue that your paranoid behavior proves you need supervised care." I was trapped in a legal catch-22. Protecting myself from Carmen's manipulation could be used as evidence that I needed protection from my own judgment. As we discussed strategy, George's phone rang with news that changed everything. Frank Morrison had made a breakthrough in his investigation of Carmen's background. "George," Frank's voice came through the speakerphone with barely controlled excitement, "you need to hear this. I found Carmen's previous employment records, and there's a pattern here that goes way beyond what we suspected." Frank had discovered that Carmen had worked at 3 different nursing homes over the past 5 years, each job ending under suspicious circumstances. At the first facility, an elderly resident had mysteriously signed over power of attorney to Carmen shortly before dying. At the second, accusations of financial impropriety had led to Carmen's quiet resignation. The third job had ended when family members of residents complained about unauthorized changes to their relatives' estate documents. "She's done this before," Frank continued, "multiple times. She targets elderly individuals with valuable assets, gains their trust or the trust of their families, then systematically positions herself to inherit or control their wealth." The revelation was both vindicating and terrifying. I wasn't the victim of an isolated scheme. I was the latest target in a pattern of elder abuse that had been going on for years. "There's more," Frank said. "Carmen's real name isn't Carmen Martinez. It's Carmen Elena Vasquez, and she has a criminal record in California for fraud and identity theft. The woman who had married my son, who had called me Mama Urs and sat at my dinner table, was a professional con artist with a history of targeting elderly victims." George was already making notes about how to present this information to the court. "This changes everything," he said. "We're not just defending against a misguided family member anymore. We're exposing a criminal enterprise." But even as relief flooded through me at finally having proof of Carmen's true nature, I realized that the most difficult challenge still lay ahead. Convincing Raphael that the woman he loved was a predator who had targeted our family for financial gain. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Raphael arrived at my house that evening, his expression grim and his manner more formal than I'd seen since childhood. "Mom," he said without preamble, "Carmen told me that you've been making serious accusations against her. That you've been spreading lies about her background and threatening her with legal action." I invited him in, but he remained standing in my entryway, his body language defensive and hostile. "Raphael," I said carefully, "I have documentation proving that Carmen has been systematically manipulating our family and attempting to gain control of my assets." "Documentation," he repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. "More of your conspiracy theories and paranoid fantasies." The pain of having my son dismiss my concerns as mental illness was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to remain calm. "She's not who she claims to be," I continued. "Her real name is Carmen Elena Vasquez, and she has a criminal record for defrauding elderly people." Raphael's expression shifted from skepticism to anger. "That's enough," he said sharply. "I won't listen to you attacking my wife with these insane allegations." "Raphael, please, I have proof." "Proof? Like your security cameras catching her moving furniture? Like your medication logs documenting pills that were never missing? Like your detailed records of imaginary break-ins?" Every piece of evidence I'd gathered had been reframed in his mind as symptoms of my deteriorating mental state. Carmen's manipulation of his perceptions had been thorough and effective. "I've made a decision," Raphael continued, his voice hard with determination. "I'm petitioning the court to accelerate the guardianship proceedings." "You're getting worse, Mom. These delusions about Carmen are dangerous, and I won't let you destroy our family with your paranoid accusations." The words hit me like physical blows. My own son was prepared to have me declared incompetent, rather than consider the possibility that his wife was a criminal. After Raphael left, I sat in Harold's chair and faced the most painful truth of this entire ordeal. I was going to lose everything. Not just my house or my independence, but my relationship with my son and any hope of exposing Carmen's crimes before she moved on to her next victim. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the security cameras that had documented Carmen's intrusions and the legal papers that outlined my fight for autonomy, I realized something important. I might lose this battle, but I didn't have to lose the war. If the legal system was determined to paint me as a confused elderly woman whose concerns could be dismissed as symptoms of decline, then I would use that perception to my advantage. Carmen thought she was dealing with a helpless victim who would eventually break under pressure. She was about to discover that this elderly woman had more fight left than she'd bargained for. The next morning, I called George and told him about Raphael's plan to accelerate the guardianship proceedings. "We need to be ready," I said. "But George, I also need you to help me with something else. Something that Carmen won't see coming." I outlined my plan, and George listened with growing amazement. "Urs," he said finally, "that's either brilliant or completely insane." "Maybe both," I replied. "But it's the only way to expose what she's really doing and protect other potential victims." The plan was risky and would require perfect timing, but it offered the possibility of turning Carmen's own tactics against her. Over the next few days, I began to play a more subtle game. Instead of fighting every intrusion and documenting every manipulation, I started to appear more vulnerable, more confused, more like the incompetent elderly woman Carmen needed me to be. I made small mistakes during Kevin's visits, seemed uncertain about dates and times, appeared to struggle with routine tasks. I let Dr. Barnes observe moments of apparent confusion and memory lapses. I created the impression that the stress of the legal proceedings was finally breaking down my resistance. The performance was convincing because it was based in genuine exhaustion and frustration. The months of psychological warfare had taken a real toll, and it wasn't difficult to let some of that damage show. Carmen noticed the change immediately. Her visits became more frequent, her manner more confident. She began to treat me with the patronizing kindness reserved for children and mental patients, speaking slowly and explaining simple concepts as if I couldn't understand them. Honey," she said during one particularly condescending visit, "I know all of this legal stuff is confusing, but Raphael and I just want what's best for you." I nodded docilely, playing the role of the defeated elderly woman who was finally accepting her fate. "Maybe you're right," I said with carefully crafted uncertainty. "Maybe I have been getting confused about things." The relief in Carmen's expression was unmistakable. She thought she had finally broken my resistance, but what Carmen didn't know was that every conversation was being recorded by the security system she thought she had neutralized, and that George was building a case that would expose not just her current scheme but her entire pattern of elder abuse. The accelerated guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Carmen was confident that she would finally gain control of my assets and remove me from my home. Raphael believed he was protecting his mother from her own declining judgment. Neither of them knew that I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence that would expose Carmen's true identity and criminal history. The confrontation in court would determine not just my future, but whether Carmen would be able to continue targeting vulnerable, elderly people with her elaborate schemes. As Thursday approached, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had done everything possible to protect myself and expose the truth. Win or lose, I would go down fighting, just as Harold would have expected. But I also knew that this final battle would test everything I had learned about survival, determination, and the strength that comes from defending what matters most. Carmen thought she was dealing with a helpless victim. She was about to face a warrior who had been fighting for her family and her home her entire life, and who wasn't about to surrender now. Thursday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made my navy suit feel heavy as I walked up the courthouse steps. Maria had flown in the night before, her face set with the same determination I'd seen when she was a teenager fighting injustice on the playground. George carried a briefcase that seemed to weigh more than usual, filled with evidence that would either vindicate me or seal my fate. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Carmen had brought additional witnesses, including a woman introduced as her former supervisor from the nursing home where she'd allegedly worked. Raphael sat behind Carmen's table, his face a mask of resigned sadness that broke my heart. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, protecting his mother from her own deteriorating mind. Judge Morrison looked tired as she reviewed the accelerated petition. The paperwork painted a picture of an elderly woman whose mental state had deteriorated rapidly under the stress of court supervision, who was now making increasingly bizarre accusations against the very family members trying to help her. Carmen's attorney spoke first, outlining the recent escalation in my alleged paranoid behavior. He presented Kevin's reports documenting my, quote, obsessive record-keeping and hypervigilant security measures. Dr. Barnes' medical evaluation was read into the record, noting my, quote, increasing paranoid ideation and declining judgment regarding interpersonal relationships. Your Honor, Carmen's lawyer continued, Mrs. Martinez has now begun making serious accusations against Mrs. Carmen Martinez, including claims of criminal behavior and identity fraud. These delusions represent a significant deterioration in her mental state and pose a danger both to herself and to innocent family members. Carmen took the witness stand with perfect composure, her voice steady as she described the painful experience of watching her beloved mother-in-law's mental decline. She spoke of my increasingly erratic behavior, my unfounded suspicions, and my hostile rejection of help from people who loved me. I never wanted it to come to this, she said, her voice breaking slightly in what appeared to be genuine emotion. But Urs has become so isolated in her delusions that she can't see reality anymore. Yesterday, she accused me of breaking into her house to move her furniture. She believes I'm stealing her medications and plotting to harm her. It's heartbreaking to watch someone you love lose touch with the world around them. Raphael's testimony was even more devastating, because it came from a place of genuine love and concern. He described phone conversations where I'd made wild accusations, visits where I'd seemed confused and agitated, and my increasing fixation on conspiracies involving his wife. "My mother raised me to be honest and fair," Raphael said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught me to see the best in people and to help those who couldn't help themselves. I think she would want me to protect her now, even if she can't understand that protection is what she needs." The case against me was compelling and emotionally powerful. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered to prove my competency had been reframed as symptoms of decline. Every action I'd taken to protect myself had been presented as proof that I needed protection from my own judgment. When it was our turn, George rose with the quiet confidence of a lawyer who knew he held the winning cards. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today not because Mrs. Martinez is incompetent, but because she has been the victim of an elaborate criminal scheme designed to steal her assets and destroy her credibility." He approached the bench with a thick folder of documents that Frank Morrison had compiled over weeks of investigation. "The woman sitting at that table is not Carmen Martinez," George continued. "Her real name is Carmen Elena Vasquez, and she has a documented history of targeting elderly individuals for financial exploitation." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Carmen's composure flickered for just a moment before she regained control, but I saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. George presented Frank's findings methodically. Employment records showing Carmen's pattern of moving between nursing homes after suspicious incidents involving elderly residents. Criminal records from California documenting her conviction for identity fraud. Financial documents showing that she was deeply in debt and facing bankruptcy when she married Raphael. "Mrs. Vasquez has used multiple identities over the past decade," George explained. "She targets families with elderly members who own valuable property, gains access through marriage or employment, then systematically undermines their credibility while positioning herself to inherit their assets." The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Frank had traced Carmen's real identity through fingerprint records, employment histories, and criminal databases. The woman who had called me Mama Urs was a professional con artist who had been planning this scheme from the moment she met Raphael. But the most damning evidence came from the security footage I'd been gathering for weeks. George presented hours of video showing Carmen entering my house without permission, systematically moving objects to create confusion, tampering with my medications, and planting evidence of my alleged incompetence. The footage showed not a concerned daughter-in-law checking on an elderly relative, but a calculating predator methodically undermining her victim's sanity. "Your Honor," George said as the final video clip played, "Mrs. Martinez hasn't been experiencing paranoid delusions. She's been documenting a criminal enterprise designed to steal her home and destroy her life." The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Raphael's face had gone white as he stared at the video evidence of his wife's deception. Carmen's carefully constructed facade finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence with growing incredulity. When she finally looked up, her expression was one of barely contained anger. "Mrs. Vasquez," she said, using Carmen's real name with deliberate emphasis, "you will remain silent while I address this court." Carmen's attorney tried to object, but Judge Morrison cut him off with a look that could have frozen water. "The evidence presented today reveals not just fraud, but a systematic attempt to manipulate this court's processes for criminal gain. Mrs. Martinez, I owe you an apology. This court was nearly used as an instrument of theft and abuse." The guardianship petition was dismissed immediately. Judge Morrison also ordered Carmen's immediate arrest on charges of fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Two bailiffs approached Carmen's table as she finally dropped her mask entirely, her face contorting with rage. "You think you've won?" she snarled at me across the courtroom. "You're still just a pathetic old woman living alone in a house too big for you. All I did was speed up the inevitable." The words were meant to hurt, but they had the opposite effect. Hearing Carmen's true voice, seeing her real nature finally exposed, only confirmed that every instinct I'd had about her was correct. Raphael sat in stunned silence as his wife was led away in handcuffs, the reality of her deception finally sinking in. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw not anger but devastation. His whole world had just collapsed, and I felt genuine sympathy for the pain he was experiencing. After the formal proceedings concluded, Raphael approached me in the courthouse hallway. His face was pale and his hands trembled as he struggled to find words. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I believed her. I actually believed that you were losing your mind." The apology meant everything to me, but I could see that Raphael was struggling with guilt and shame that would take time to heal. "Mijo," I said gently. "She was very convincing. She fooled professionals, judges, social workers. She made a career out of fooling people." "But I should have trusted you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You're my mother. I should have known." We talked for a long time in that courthouse hallway, beginning the slow process of rebuilding trust and understanding. Raphael told me about subtle ways Carmen had manipulated his perceptions over months, feeding him carefully crafted stories about my declining health and presenting evidence of my alleged confusion. "She showed me photographs of your house that made it look dangerous and poorly maintained," he said. "She played recordings of phone conversations where you supposedly sounded confused, but now I realize they must have been edited or taken out of context." The sophistication of Carmen's scheme was staggering. She hadn't just lied about me. She'd created an entire fictional narrative supported by manufactured evidence designed to convince my own son that I was incompetent. Frank Morrison joined us as we left the courthouse, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, "you should know that the FBI is interested in this case. Carmen's pattern of elder abuse crosses state lines, and they believe she may be connected to similar schemes in other jurisdictions." The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Carmen's criminal enterprise. She was part of a network of con artists who specialized in targeting elderly individuals with valuable assets. Her marriage to Raphael hadn't been motivated by love but by careful research into our family's financial situation and property holdings. The house on Maple Street that Harold and I had built our life in was worth more than I'd realized, and Carmen had spent months planning how to gain control of it. The basement incident, the social services reports, the manufactured evidence of my incompetence, all of it had been designed to support a legal strategy that would have given her access to everything Harold and I had worked to build. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was that I hadn't been her only target. Frank's investigation revealed at least 6 other elderly individuals who had been victimized by Carmen's schemes over the past decade. Some had lost their homes, others had been placed in nursing facilities against their will, and at least 2 had died under suspicious circumstances after signing over power of attorney. The criminal charges against Carmen multiplied as more victims came forward. What had started as a guardianship hearing became the foundation for a federal investigation into organized elder abuse that would ultimately put several people in prison for decades. The weeks following the trial were both liberating and challenging. I was finally free from court supervision, free from daily intrusions and weekly evaluations, free to live in my own home without constantly justifying my competence. But I was also dealing with the emotional aftermath of months of psychological warfare and the complicated process of rebuilding my relationship with Raphael. My son struggled with guilt and anger in equal measure. He was furious at Carmen for deceiving him, but also angry at himself for being so easily manipulated. He threw himself into helping with my recovery, visiting daily, and taking on home maintenance tasks that he thought I might be struggling with. "Raphael," I told him one evening as he insisted on reorganizing my medicine cabinet for the 3rd time, "you don't have to prove your love by treating me like I'm fragile. I survived Carmen's attack because I'm stronger than she thought, not weaker." It took time for him to understand that his guilt was making him overprotective in ways that weren't helpful. I needed him to trust my judgment and respect my independence, not hover over me as if I might collapse at any moment. Maria's support during this period was invaluable. She stayed for 2 weeks after the trial, helping me process the trauma of what I'd experienced and celebrating the victory we'd achieved together. "Mom," she said as we sat in the garden where Harold's tomatoes were producing their final harvest of the season, "you saved yourself. But more than that, you probably saved other people from going through what you experienced. The truth of that statement became clear as the federal investigation expanded. Carmen's network had been targeting elderly individuals across multiple states, and my fight had exposed a criminal enterprise that might have continued for years without detection. George estimated that my security footage and documentation had prevented Carmen from stealing assets worth millions of dollars from various victims. The evidence I'd gathered had also provided law enforcement with the tools they needed to trace the network's activities and identify other perpetrators. But the victory came with costs that extended beyond the legal and financial. The months of psychological manipulation had taken a real toll on my confidence and sense of security. I found myself checking and double-checking locks, reviewing security footage obsessively, and questioning my own perceptions in ways that hadn't been necessary before Carmen's campaign. Dr. Kim, the psychiatrist who had evaluated my competency, helped me understand that these were normal responses to psychological trauma. Mrs. Martinez, she explained during one of our sessions, you experienced a form of psychological torture designed to make you doubt your own reality. The fact that you maintained your sanity and fought back successfully is remarkable, but it's natural for there to be lasting effects. Recovery wasn't just about regaining my independence. It was about rebuilding my trust in my own judgment and learning to feel safe in my own home again. The process was gradual but steady. I started by reducing my security monitoring, gradually scaling back the surveillance that had been necessary during Carmen's attacks. I began to trust that the small changes in my environment were the result of normal life, not calculated manipulation. Most importantly, I started to reclaim the joy I'd always found in my home and garden. Harold's tomatoes that final autumn were the best I'd tasted in years, and I found myself sitting in his chair in the evenings, remembering the good times we'd shared, rather than dwelling on the recent trauma. 3 months after the trial, I received unexpected news that provided a different kind of closure. Frank Morrison called to tell me that Carmen had agreed to plead guilty to multiple federal charges in exchange for providing information about her criminal network. Her cooperation had led to the arrest of 6 other individuals involved in elder abuse schemes across 4 states. She's going to serve 15 to 20 years in federal prison, Frank told me, and she'll be required to pay restitution to all of her victims. The financial restitution would help some of the people Carmen had robbed, but no amount of money could fully repair the damage she'd done to families and individuals who had trusted her. Raphael struggled with the news of Carmen's plea deal. Part of him was relieved that she would be held accountable for her crimes, but he was also dealing with the complex emotions of having loved someone who turned out to be a predator. I keep thinking about all the times she seemed so caring, he told me during one of our weekly dinners. The way she helped you with errands, the way she talked about wanting to take care of you. Was any of it real? It was a question that didn't have a simple answer. Carmen had been skilled at mimicking genuine emotion and authentic concern, but everything she'd done had been calculated to serve her larger scheme. The important thing, I told Raphael, is that you recognized the truth when it was presented clearly. You chose to believe the evidence rather than continue supporting a lie. Our relationship continued to heal slowly but steadily. Raphael began to understand that my strength during the crisis hadn't been an anomaly, but a reflection of who I'd always been. He started asking for my advice again, sharing his struggles with the divorce proceedings and the process of rebuilding his life. The house on Maple Street gradually felt like home again, rather than a fortress under siege. I removed some of the security cameras, though I kept the basic alarm system that had proven so valuable. I started inviting friends over for dinner again, something I'd stopped doing during the worst of Carmen's psychological attacks. Most meaningfully, I began planning for the future rather than just defending against immediate threats. I worked with George to establish a trust that would protect my assets while ensuring that Maria and her children would eventually inherit the house and property that Harold and I had built our lives around. The trust included specific provisions designed to prevent the kind of manipulation I'd experienced. Any future changes would require approval from multiple trustees, and detailed documentation would be required for any major decisions affecting my care or living situation. You're ensuring that what happened to you can't happen to your children or grandchildren, George explained as we finalized the legal documents. But more than that, you're modeling how to fight back against this kind of abuse. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from an elderly woman in Oregon whose daughter had tried to have her declared incompetent in order to gain control of her property. The woman had read about my case in a news article and wanted to thank me for fighting back. "Your story gave me courage to hire my own lawyer and investigate my daughter's claims," she wrote. "It turns out she was stealing from me for years, but I was too ashamed to admit that my own child would do such a thing. Seeing that you fought back against family manipulation helped me understand that love and loyalty shouldn't require giving up my rights." The letter was the first of many I received from elderly individuals and their advocates who had been inspired by my fight against Carmen's scheme. Some were dealing with similar situations. Others were taking preventative measures to protect themselves from potential abuse. I began speaking at senior centers and community organizations about financial elder abuse, sharing my story, and educating others about the warning signs of manipulation and exploitation. The presentations were emotionally difficult at first, but they also provided a sense of purpose that helped transform my trauma into something meaningful. The most important thing to remember, I would tell audiences, is that aging doesn't mean surrendering your right to make decisions about your own life. If someone is pressuring you to give up control, if they're questioning your judgment or isolating you from other sources of support, trust your instincts and ask for help. The speaking engagements also connected me with other survivors of elder abuse, and I found strength in sharing experiences with people who understood the particular challenge of fighting back against family members or trusted individuals who had betrayed that trust. 1 year after the trial, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee investigating elder abuse and the legal system's response to financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. The hearing room was intimidating, filled with legislators and policy experts, but I had learned not to be intimidated by official proceedings. "Honorable members," I said when called to speak, "I'm here not as a victim but as a survivor who wants to help protect other elderly Americans from the kind of systematic abuse I experienced." I described Carmen's scheme and the ways that legitimate concerns about elder safety could be weaponized by predators seeking to exploit the legal system. I explained how guardianship proceedings, designed to protect vulnerable individuals, could be manipulated to strip competent people of their rights and property. "The woman who targeted me was a professional criminal with a documented history of elder abuse," I continued. "But she was able to convince social workers, medical professionals, and even a judge that I was incompetent because our legal system assumes that elderly individuals who express concerns about family members must be confused or paranoid." My testimony contributed to federal legislation strengthening protections for elderly individuals facing guardianship proceedings and requiring more thorough background checks for people seeking to become guardians of vulnerable adults. But perhaps the most personally meaningful outcome of my experience was the way it deepened my relationship with my grandchildren. Maria's teenagers, who had heard bits and pieces of the story from their mother, asked me to tell them the full account of how I'd fought back against Carmen's scheme. "Grandma Urs," my 16-year-old granddaughter Elena said after hearing the complete story, "you're like a superhero. You saved yourself and helped protect other people too." The conversation led to discussions about standing up to bullies, trusting your instincts, and the importance of fighting for what's right even when it's difficult. I realized that my grandchildren were learning lessons about courage and resilience that would serve them throughout their lives. 2 years after the trial, Raphael remarried a woman named Lisa who was a teacher at the local elementary school. Their courtship was slow and careful, with Raphael introducing her to the family gradually and making sure everyone felt comfortable with the relationship. Lisa was kind and genuine in ways that made Carmen's manipulative performance seem even more grotesque in retrospect. She asked thoughtful questions about Harold, admired the garden we'd built together, and showed genuine interest in family stories and traditions. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, during their first dinner at my house, "Raphael has told me about what you went through with his first wife. I want you to know that I understand why trust doesn't come easily, and I'm willing to earn it over time." The honesty and directness of her approach was refreshing after Carmen's elaborate deceptions. Lisa didn't try to rush intimacy or claim a relationship she hadn't earned. She simply showed up consistently and proved through her actions that she was worthy of inclusion in our family. Their wedding was a small ceremony in my backyard, surrounded by Harold's roses and the vegetable garden that still produced his favorite tomatoes every summer. As I watched Raphael say his vows to a woman who truly loved him, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since Carmen's deception was exposed. The house on Maple Street continued to be my sanctuary and my strength. I made some modifications as I aged, installing grab bars in the bathroom and a ramp to the front door, but I never considered leaving. This was where Harold and I had built our life together, where I'd raised my children, and where I'd learned to fight for what mattered most. On quiet evenings, I would sit in Harold's chair and think about the lessons I'd learned from my battle with Carmen. The experience had taught me that strength comes not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them directly. That love sometimes requires saying no to people who claim to care about you. That trusting your instincts is more important than avoiding conflict. Most importantly, I'd learned that age brings wisdom and experience that can't be dismissed or diminished by people who see elderly individuals as easy targets. Carmen had chosen me because she thought I was vulnerable and isolated. She'd miscalculated in ways that ultimately led to her downfall and the exposure of an entire criminal network. 5 years after the trial, I received news that Carmen had died in federal prison. She'd been serving her sentence at a facility in Texas, and according to the brief news report, she'd suffered a heart attack during the night. I felt no satisfaction at the news, only a sense of closure. Carmen's death meant that her victims could finally move forward, without the possibility of her eventual release and potential retaliation. It also meant that the chapter of my life defined by her manipulation was truly finished. That same year, I decided to write a book about my experience, working with a ghostwriter to tell the complete story of Carmen's scheme and my fight to expose it. The book was published by a small press specializing in true crime and elder advocacy, and it found an audience among elderly readers and their families. The woman who crawled to her bank fighting back against elder abuse became a resource for people facing similar situations and for professionals working with elderly clients. The title reflected not just my physical journey to protect my assets, but the metaphorical crawling I'd done through a legal and social system that was predisposed to dismiss my concerns. Book signings and speaking engagements kept me busy and connected to communities of people working to prevent elder abuse. I met social workers who were implementing new protocols for investigating family-reported competency concerns, lawyers who were specializing in elder abuse cases, and law enforcement officers who were learning to recognize the signs of financial exploitation. But the most meaningful connections were with other survivors who had found the courage to fight back against abuse and manipulation. Their stories reminded me that my experience, while traumatic, had contributed to a larger movement of elderly individuals refusing to be victimized by people who underestimated their strength and determination. As I approached my 80th birthday, I remained in my house on Maple Street, surrounded by Harold's garden and the memories we'd created together. Raphael and Lisa visited regularly, their children filling the house with laughter and energy that reminded me of raising my own family decades earlier. Maria had moved back to Arizona but called every week and visited several times a year. Her children, now young adults, considered me a role model for standing up to bullies and fighting for justice. They would bring friends to meet the grandmother who had taken down a criminal network and testified before Congress. The security system I'd installed during Carmen's attacks had been simplified, but not removed entirely. I'd learned that reasonable precautions weren't signs of paranoia, but evidence of wisdom gained through experience. The cameras and alarms made me feel safe without making me feel imprisoned in my own home. Most evenings, I would sit in Harold's chair and reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd survived my husband's death, raised successful children, and defended my home and independence against a sophisticated criminal attack. I'd learned that strength doesn't diminish with age but deepens with experience and determination. The house around me held decades of memories, but it also represented something larger, the right of elderly individuals to live with dignity and autonomy, to make their own decisions about their care and their future, and to be believed when they report abuse or exploitation. Carmen had thought she was targeting a vulnerable elderly woman who would be easily manipulated and ultimately defeated. Instead, she'd encountered someone who refused to surrender what mattered most, who fought back with intelligence and determination, and who ultimately helped protect other potential victims from similar abuse. As I turned off the lights each night and activated the security system that had once seemed like evidence of paranoia but now felt like reasonable protection, I would think about Harold and the promises we'd made to each other about fighting for our family and our home. I'd kept those promises not just by defending what we'd built together, but by showing that elderly individuals possess strength and wisdom that shouldn't be underestimated or dismissed. Carmen's scheme had failed not because I was lucky, but because I was determined to preserve my independence and protect others from experiencing what I'd endured. The woman who had crawled through a legal system designed to protect her by taking away her rights had ultimately crawled all the way to victory, proving that age brings not weakness, but the kind of fierce determination that comes from having too much to lose and too much wisdom to surrender without a fight. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.